So, with our next lecture and our final lecture for this course, we turn to an examination of some of the earliest civilizations in the Americas. And so we might start by considering, it's kind of always coming back to this fundamental question with history. How do we know what we know? And of course, for historians, the primary, quote unquote, primary source of information are written sources, right? This is kind of the bread and butter, if you will, of historians. And in the case of, some of these early civilizations in the Americas, we run into two problems. Either we do have written records, but we haven't fully deciphered them, or in the case of Andean civilizations, we really don't have writing at all, right? So other Mesoamericans, American civilizations, we do have a written record, but we haven't deciphered it, so literally we can't read it, right? Which hopefully one day we'll overcome that obstacle. But again, in the case of Andean civilizations in South America, roughly corresponding to modern-day Peru, they never really developed writing, which, by the way, is a fascinating factor, inasmuch as in most cases where we find evidence of a sophisticated, highly developed civilization, right, very complex in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of political hierarchy and so forth, we almost always find writing. So that in and of itself is quite interesting, right? But as far as reconstructing the history of these civilizations, it does create a few difficulties, right, in terms of how to work around that. Another important source of information are the accounts of Europeans, right, particularly Spanish missionaries and officials, who at some point arrive, eventually assert their political control. So in many cases, those sources are being used to kind of, work our way backwards, right, to kind of what we might define as pre-Columbian America, right, prior to the arrival of Europeans. And of course, they were recording information regarding what was going on at the time, but also, concerning what they had learned about the histories of the different peoples they encountered. Of course, we have to bear in mind that these sources reflect very much a European perspective or interpretation, and therefore there are certain biases inherent that we have to account for. Just to begin with, right, very often we're using a European historical framework to try and understand the history of America before it became America, right? So that can be problematic in a kind of historiographical or theoretical sense. Now we're going to begin with a region we generally refer to as Mesoamerica, roughly corresponding to the modern states of Mexico, the states that we find in Central America like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and so forth. Of course, these national borders would have been irrelevant in the pre-Columbian period. This map also gives you an idea about the topography, right? The kinds of environments that we find in Mesoamerica. That actually is pretty relevant. So, kind of the further south we go, particularly in the Yucatan Peninsula, kind of more tropical environment. In the center, much more temperate zone to some degree, because of the fact that it's at a higher altitude, kind of a very large plateau region. And then the further north, it becomes much more arid, right? So we start to come into a more desert environment. Now, we're going to see many different civilizations emerge within Mesoamerica over the period of time that we're going to look at. Though we should note, we find certain general shared characteristics or general aspects of Mesoamerican culture that to some degree also distinguish it from the Andean region, right? So for instance, compared to the Andean region, metallurgy is going to come somewhat late to Mesoamerica and will be primarily for ceremonial objects. As far as weapons and tools, the main material that will be used is obsidian or volcanic glass. And I think most of us know what obsidian looks like, right? Like can have a kind of reflective quality, for instance, and to some degree it's pretty easy to shape. As far as their diet, the primary source of protein will be maize and beans, maize as in corn. Not much in the way of meat, right? Very little, in fact, by way of domesticated animals, either as a source of protein or as draft animals. In some ways, that distinguishes it more from the quote-unquote old world, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and so forth, than it does from the rest of the New World, the Andean region, right? So, you're not going to see large beasts of burden like horses, oxen, or, camels and sheep as a source of protein, also clothing material, and so forth. In the case of Mesoamerican cultures, related to that, they never actually developed the wheel, right? And this, kind of really shows that truly necessity is the mother of invention, right? They really, there's just no reason to develop the wheel, both partly because of the topography, not well suited for wheeled vehicles to travel on, but also you don't have large animals that might pull whatever kind of vehicle you might be talking about. So again, something that kind of distinguishes Mesoamerican culture from other parts of the world. Now, when we look at Mesoamerican history during the pre-Columbian period, we generally break it down into 4 different categories. And I want to note right up front, this does in some ways reflect a European perspective, right? They're kind of using the terminology that would be appropriate for, say, European history, or even to some degree, Middle East history, Asian history, and so forth. So kind of borrowing from European historiography. And to some degree, it does kind of work, but it is kind of helpful to realize that it doesn't necessarily reflect a, shall we say, Mesoamerican perspective on their own history. But again, to some degree, we really have no other choice because, again, we haven't deciphered what writing we do have. In other cases, we don't have writing to begin with. So the periodization of Mesoamerican history, we break it down. First, you have the Archaic period, and that would be during which we see a transition from hunting to gathering and then to settled village life, right? So kind of corresponding, you might remember at the very beginning of this course, we talked about the Neolithic Revolution. After that, we have the Formative period, probably characterized most prominently by the development of ball games, right? And then we're going to look at that more closely, but that is like a very common element to many different Mesoamerican civilizations and cultures. Then we hit the Classic period and the emergence of the Mayans, probably the most important civilization in Mesoamerica. And then finally, or at least early on, and then after that, the post-Classic period, defined primarily by first the Toltecs and then Aztec civilization. So we're going to start with the Formative period, and again, probably the most defining characteristic, regardless of what part of Mesoamerica you're talking about, the ball game. Likely dating from about 1700 BCE, first appearing among the oldest civilization, Mesoamerican civilization, the Olmec. And there will be some variation in terms of what form the game actually takes, in terms of the rules, exactly how it's practiced. But there are some common elements from beginning to end, right? So it's always centered on the use of a hard bouncing rubber ball. It's definitely a team sport involving multiple players and almost always taking place on an eye-shaped court. Later on, we see the introduction of hoops, the idea that you have to get the ball through the hoop. And then that becomes very prevalent as well. These games were not for the faint of heart. They were dangerous, often violent. Players had to wear special padding in order to protect themselves. And we should note that the games were not strictly for the sake of entertainment, as we tend to think of team sports today, right? Often carrying elaborate political and ritualistic overtones, right? So very often a very strong religious dimension, sometimes involving the reenactment of mythical events. And then politically, it might be a way to settle a political dispute without, actually going to war. So very much integrated into Mesoamerican culture in many different facets of their culture and their civilization. And here we see 2 different images in the upper left-hand corner, kind of an artistic depiction of what a typical Mesoamerican ball game might have looked like. And you can see that in the background you have a temple. On kind of the right side you can see a hoop. And then in the lower right-hand corner, we have the archaeological remains of an actual court. This one, I believe, is from the Mayan period. I think I might actually have seen this when I was on vacation in the Yucatan. But it's kind of hard to say. They're in many ways very similar to one another. So if we're going to begin with the formative period, we might start with the earliest Mesoamerican civilization, the Olmecs, dating from what sometimes we refer to as the early formative period. They were based in the lowlands of Mexico's coast. And pretty much everything we know about the Olmecs comes from archaeological sites, the two most important of which are San Lorenzo and La Venta. By the way, when we say the two most important, we mean in the sense that they provide archaeologists with a lot of information. It's kind of hard to say that they were the two most important sites back in their day. They're not exactly cities, not in a conventional sense, right? Respective populations numbering less than 1,000. We find a lot of monumental structures, which would seem to suggest they serve very specific political and or religious functions. It would seem that, in terms of what kind of society they had, you had a very clear political hierarchy, likely a society dominated by an elite class of ruler priests, who certainly had the ability to command the labor of the rest of the population, probably residing in the countryside, but whom could be called upon in order to create these monumental cities, if you will. So looking a bit more closely at each, we have San Lorenzo. So what do we know about it? First occupied in 1500 BCE, would seem to have been flourishing between 1200 and 900 BCE, and then to all appearances abandoned by about 400 BCE. Right? So again, mostly a city of monuments, mostly public buildings. We find extensive pavements. Definitely indication of rather sophisticated engineering capability. We find a drainage system linked to artificial ponds, and of course a ball court. For the most part, these structures are made of basalt stone, right? So obsidian wouldn't be used for large structures. Significantly, most of the stone here was conveyed from miles away, right? So another indication of the ability of the political elite to control the labor of large numbers of people. And then on the left side, you see an image of a massive basalt stonehead, which most archaeologists feel is the portrait of an Olmec ruler. And then La Venta, which flourished between 900 400 BCE, so not overlapping precisely with San Lorenzo in that regard. Probably best known for its 110-foot scalloped pyramid, scalloped referring to this kind of concave curvature in the sides of the pyramid, often known as the Great Pyramid, but this is an adjective that we find appended to many pyramids throughout history. More interesting is that it stands at one end of a group of platforms and plazas along a north-south axis, suggesting that it's part of a religious complex. We know that the Olmec were very much involved in trade. This is evident, for instance, in the fact that much of the material they use, whether obsidian or also jade, very commonly used, coming from other regions of Mesoamerica. Very well-crafted artifacts are found at San Lorenzo and La Venta. We also find Olmec goods and iconography, right? Other people's borrowing the imagery that they often used in their own artifacts. Really strongly suggesting that they were very well integrated into a network of trade or a web of trade that linked different parts of Mesoamerica. And by the way, probably the most famous icon, right, kind of image used in Olmec iconography would be the jaguar, and we're going to see that is going to continue to be very prevalent with other civilizations, including Mesoamerican civilizations, including the Maya. So here we have a map, right, kind of our best guess at the different Mesoamerican trade routes from the formative period, kind of based on what artifacts we find where, and also evidence of the travel of different materials and so forth, right? So covering quite a bit of ground there. And ultimately also connecting with another region in Mexico, the Oaxaca Valley. Though here a lot of the kind of important developments we see civilizationally in terms of the archaeological record dating from the late formative period, right? So in this regard overlapping with the Olmecs but not of the same culture or civilization. Really good example of this would be San José Mogote. which by around 600 BCE was apparently a thriving center of about 1,000 people. Here we see part of the archaeological record from San José Mogote, the main pyramid. Another important center in the Oaxaca region would have been Monte Alban, which dates from around 500 BCE, at which point it seems to have emerged as the capital of a larger state, and perhaps the dominant state in the Oaxaca region. By 200 BCE, its population numbered as many as 1,700 inhabitants. And, if you think about the kind of demographic numbers we've been talking about until now, they are starting to get a bit bigger. But one thing that does seem clear is that cities didn't serve exactly the same purpose that we often associate with cities, right? As simply being kind of a place where large numbers of inhabitants reside, right? It seems that cities served kind of more specific, more narrowly defined functions, with the larger portion of respective populations living in the countryside. One practice that will eventually become very prevalent throughout Mesoamerica, right up until the time of the Aztecs, will be human sacrifice, right? The ritual of human sacrifice, which may have begun in the Oaxaca region. We find archaeological evidence there suggestive of this, for instance, carved images of bound prisoners, which we find at both of the two sites that we just discussed. Also suggests that warfare played a very important role in establishing the state's authority, for instance, in the case of Monte Alban. But also suggesting the early origins of ritual human sacrifice, which eventually will characterize Mesoamerican cultures from beginning to end, right? Probably most famously with the Aztecs. And we also find the first evidence of writing in the valley of Oaxaca, also the first Mesoamerican calendar. And Mesoamerican calendars are really interesting, right? They become quite famous, particularly the Mayan calendar, which becomes the basis of this idea that the world would end in 2012. Little did we know it would actually end in 2020. Sorry, just a little gallows humor there. But very often what you have are these calendars made up of multiple interlocking cycles, right? The exact purpose of having a number of different cycles that operate on different time spans, but are somehow interconnected with one another, not entirely clear. In the case of the Oaxacan calendar, you had two interlocking cycles, one tied to the solar year, lasting 365 days, and the other consisting of 260 days. And the two together would combine to produce a 52-year century, essentially the time required before a particular combination of days in each cycle repeated itself, right? Again, the exact purpose of these interlocking systems, kind of hard to say, would suggest a certain understanding of astronomy, also probably serving some kind of religious purpose or ritualistic purpose. But again, to some degree, the exact purpose is still the subject of debate. In any event, that now brings us to what we often refer to as the Classic period, which will be dominated by the rise of Teotihuacán, so a city-state located today, roughly outside of modern-day Mexico City, and the Maya in the Yucatan. So I mentioned that we do have writing in the case of the Maya. The problem is deciphering it, and it does. We have started to make some progress in that regard. Essentially, they are hieroglyphics, right? So it's not a phonetic alphabet. And of course, we have the archaeological record, right? The ideal is to somehow combine what we can learn from the written record with, possible interpretations of the archaeological record. And the more we're able to decipher Mayan hieroglyphics, the more insights we end up having regarding both the Teotihuacan society and the Maya. What do we know about both, right? Both societies defined by cities consisting of multiple temples, plazas, and administrative buildings. Cities are becoming bigger. Rulers appear in both cases to combine religious with political authority. And in both cases, we find evidence of chronic warfare, inclusive of human sacrifice, ritualistically, and pretty much always involving captive enemies. So we might start with Teotihuacán, which literally means where the gods were born. First to note, the name of the city is what the Aztecs called it. We don't really know what the people who lived there called it. So again, this is a problem of whether we have access or the ability to decipher written languages from that period. It's a very popular tourist destination. I was very happy to go there when I was visiting Mexico City. It's only about 30 kilometers north of the city. And chronologically speaking, existed around the same time as another important city, Cuicuilco, which was located at the southern end of the Valley of Mexico, and then really came to prominence when that city was destroyed by a volcanic eruption around the 1st century CE. And at that point, Teotihuacan emerged as the dominant city in Mesoamerica. And I think this image gives you a pretty good idea of why it's a very popular tourist destination. The center of Teotihuacan, dominated by a number of pyramids, plazas, and so forth, really in a very good state of repair. It's a very large area. I mean, you really can spend a full day there. At its height would number more than 150,000 residents. So in some ways, right, I mean, this is a huge jump population-wise from what we've been talking about until now, right? The first true city-state in Mesoamerica. And if you have that many people living in one place, it's fair to call it a successful city. The reason why it's located there might be actually a pseudo-religious explanation that it was kind of a location of prestige due to a network of caves beneath the city, possibly viewed as an entrance to the underworld realm of deities. In any event, the stone quarried from the caves were actually used to construct the city's buildings. Ultimately, its success pretty much economically based. It was rooted in trade and farming. So first of all, the city was located near an important source of obsidian, a very valued material for many kinds of items, weapons, tools, also ornaments and so forth. It had a good location in terms of the various trade routes running through Mesoamerica, right? Especially connecting the Gulf Coast to the southern part of Mesoamerica, and surrounded by fertile farmland well suited to intensive cultivation with terracing and irrigation. On the basis of its economic success, clearly a very important city politically, likely ruled by a powerful centralized authority, though we really don't know a lot about how things were set up politically. It also seems pretty clear it had a kind of religious significance. Probably, the most dominant part of the city visually is this very broad 3-mile-long thoroughfare, known by the Aztec at least as the Avenue of the Dead. But given the proximity of the pyramids, I think it's a pretty safe bet that it had a kind of religious function. Speaking of the pyramids, there are 2 pyramids that are really dominant here. You have the Pyramid of the Moon, located at one end of the avenue, and then you have very nearby the 210-foot Pyramid of the Sun. Again, in a really good state of repair. And one thing that, I really enjoyed when I was there, something you can't do if you visit the pyramids in Egypt, is climbing to the top of them, right? So you actually have stairs leading you up, and you're more than welcome to make the journey. In the case of Egypt, you probably could climb up the pyramids. It's the surfaces of the pyramids are not smooth, but it would really be something heavily frowned upon. And so we mentioned that the population of Teotihuacan is quite large, so a lot of people actually living in the city, not devoted just to political and or religious functions. You have about 2,000 residential structures surrounding the city center, and a little bit like what we saw in Mesopotamia, if you remember from earlier on in the course, the richer you are, the more important you are politically. If you're among the elite, you live closer to the center. And then you have actually compounds devoted to different kinds of economic activities. They're kind of further away from the center. But for instance, you might have one devoted to craft manufacture, other neighborhoods devoted to pottery, obsidian work, and other specialties. And then you even had compounds reserved for foreign traders, right? So another indication of the fact that Teotihuacan is really plugged in to this network of trade, right? So we're pretty sure like one compound would have been reserved for people from Monte Alban, another people from the Oaxaca region, and so forth. And another indication of Teotihuacan's influence, particularly in the center of Mexico, right? In the Central Highlands, we find, in the vicinity of Teotihuacan, the emergence of, these kind of dispersed settlements that eventually become consolidated into larger centers, very, structured in a way very imitative of Teotihuacan, even suggesting that perhaps they were under its direct control to the extent that we could speak of a Teotihuacan empire. Again, though, we can't say with any certitude that that was the case, right? But that would be one interpretation of the archaeological evidence. And then we have evidence of its influence further afield of a more direct nature. For instance, architecturally, buildings that very often resemble the structures that we find in Teotihuacan. And then finally, evidence of trade interaction. For instance, evidence that merchants from Teotihuacan were actually visiting there. For instance, with respect to buildings in Caminaljuyu, which is located in territory corresponding to modern-day Guatemala. And what do we mean by, saying that, we find structures architecturally resembling those that we find in Teotihuacan? We're probably more correct to say architectural elements, and very often we're actually talking about sculptures that we find on various structures, very pervasive in Teotihuacan, almost certainly representing certain religious beliefs, which would suggest that we find these images elsewhere, that there's also a kind of religious influence or connection. Certainly that's going to be the case with the Aztecs, right? So again, we find these sculptures throughout Teotihuacan. Many buildings decorated with them. I mean, they're very skillfully made. Clearly, in many cases, representing the city's gods or ritual practices. And again, we find many of the same images within Aztec architecture, right? Aztec art. Some of these gods likely antecedents for Aztecan gods. One example where it's almost certainly the case, the Aztecs' rain god Tlaloc almost certainly has an antecedent in Teotihuacan, but not only him, right? We find, for instance, his consort. The pronunciation of this name I'm not even going to attempt, but again, we find very often, very similar images, kind of similar scenes being depicting, and so forth. Probably the most important would be Quetzalcoatl. This is maybe the most famous Aztec god, often depicted as a feathered serpent, and lo and behold, we find exactly the same image of a god worshipped by the people of Teotihuacan. In a very distinct image, right? So it's kind of hard to imagine that it's just a coincidence that they should look so similar. And we find evidence of human sacrifice, right? Both kind of artistic depictions that suggest it was a kind of ritual practice in Teotihuacan. For instance, we find murals of people in Teotihuacan drawing their own blood as a form of sacrifice, much like the Maya and later Mesoamerican people. But then other kinds of evidence suggesting that large numbers of people were subjected to the practice, right? For instance, a mass burial under one of the city's principal temples. And then of course you can examine the remains of the bodies and find indication of how they died and so forth. So Teotihuacan will eventually come to an end, or at least its importance will greatly diminish. So probably from around 500 CE, its influence is beginning to wane. We're not entirely sure. We have evidence of a fire sweeping through the city in the 8th century, but that's a bit down the road. That might, be more a consequence of its decline. It certainly hints at an internal revolt, so there's some kind of political issue. There's also evidence of climatic changes that might have undermined its agricultural production, so that might have been a factor. People will continue to inhabit this city, right? But it will never regain its former status. though it does become an important pilgrimage site for the native people of Mesoamerica, including the Aztec, right up until the time of the Spanish conquest. And that now brings us to maybe the most famous civilization up until this point, that of the Mayan, right? Centered in southern Mesoamerica, roughly corresponding to the Yucatan Peninsula, but also including territory corresponding to the states of Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. And the beginnings of Mayan civilization probably dating back to the first millennium B.C.E., where we find evidence of village life, but the earliest Mayan urban site only dating to around 800 B.C.E., a good example of which would be Nakbe. So probably the thing most associated with the Mayan, I mean, even let's say you don't know much about them, but you probably heard of them, you probably know they had pyramids, right? In the case of the Mayan, pyramids were tombs. So in this respect, more like the ancient Egyptians than what we saw in Teotihuacán. Pyramids, a very prominent feature between around 300 BCE and 300 CE. And that was definitely a period where the Mayan culture, Mayan civilization flourished. You had some very important urban centers during this period, such as El Mirador, but eventually they ended up being abandoned. But the Mayan wouldn't be done. They would actually kind of have a rebirth during the later Classic period, with Mayan civilization shifting to the southern part of Yucatan. So one really nice thing from the point of view of historians with respect to the Mayans is that we have access to Mayan writing. So they're not the only Mesoamerican civilization to have writing, but we've made a little bit more headway as far as deciphering it, and to some extent better or more well preserved than has often been the case, right? So first of all, a lot of it was inscribed on imperishable materials such as stone and pottery, right? So it preserves well, even where that's not the case. So for instance, a lot of it was on scrolls or screenfold books made with deer hide or bark paper, and you know, that will probably survive a bit better than, say, conventional paper, but a lot of that did eventually decay. Even more unfortunately, when the Spanish arrived, many Spanish priests burned whatever they came across as being pagan. Having said that, though, 4 important Mayan books did survive, and this does provide, you know, some information about Mayan civilization, helps us to interpret the archaeological record. And so here you see an example of the Mayan script. And as you can see, I mean, it's more hieroglyphics, you know, kind of symbols than anything resembling a phonetic alphabet. So what have these texts been able to tell us, right? So first of all, a lot of these advances that helped us to decipher Mayan texts, to actually read what they were writing, kind of dating to the late 20th century. And what happens when you're able to read stuff, then you kind of reconsider the archaeological record, what you thought it was telling you, right? So for instance, up until that point, it had been believed that urban centers were fairly empty ceremonial sites inhabited really just by scholar priests, right? That there weren't any, you know, kind of large populations residing there. We now know that we were wrong. They actually had large populations. One reason we didn't think that that was the case was because, you know, given that Mayan civilization is developing in kind of a jungle environment, so it was really kind of believed that you couldn't produce enough food to sustain a large urban population, right? But then, you know, kind of reconsidering the archaeological evidence based on what we're learning from the text, we understand that they had a highly developed kind of agricultural technology. They had developed very sophisticated forms of terracing, irrigation that allowed large yields in jungle environments, right? And so we know now that, you know, for instance, the archaeological site of Tikal probably had as many as 50 to 70,000 people living there. Now, probably what you know, being able to read the writing has most informed us about is Mayan politics, right? Most, you know, that's because a lot of the writing was really about glorifying rulers, but also told us a lot about the various battles that were held. We really understand that warfare was something very chronic within Mayan society. Captured prisoners, frequently sacrificed to appease the gods, but also to glorify the ruler. And we know that religious and political authority was combined in a single individual, right? The ruler had both religious and political authority. The ruler claimed to be associated with the gods, and that was a basis for justifying their authority. So, a lot of this kind of conventional stuff that we've encountered before. But we've also seen that there can be tremendous variation in this regard, right? So, it's nothing that you could have just assumed from the archaeological evidence. We also learned quite a bit about Mayan religion. For instance, that they believed the world had gone through several cycles of creation before the present one, which, is kind of interesting if you consider there are certain theories about the Big Bang that it actually happened more than once. They definitely, this is very different from our own modern day perspective. They didn't make a distinction between the natural and supernatural realms. And finally, this is very familiar, the fact that rulers participated in public rituals and ceremonies, wore special regalia in connection with that. And, that they played a very important role in maintaining the cosmic balance. And of course, that would also demonstrate their close relationship with the gods. We also learn about their creation myth, the details of which I'm not going to go into here, but kind of briefly summarized, involving two plumed serpents who are the creators of the world. And then there are stories involving the ball game. The ball game, of course, a very prominent aspect of Mayan civilization. All Mayan cities had ball game courts. And in fact, when engaging in a ball game, very often is served as a symbolic reenactment of the Mayan creation myth, involving these two godlike beings known as the hero twins, who defeat the gods of the underworld and then return to life after being sacrificed, right? So kind of also tying in with this ritual of human sacrifice, one of them becoming the sun, the other Venus, though I've also heard it told where one of them became the moon. And by the way, we're pretty sure that in some cases, particularly if the ball game was serving a religious function, the losing team was often sacrificed. So pretty good incentive for winning the match. The Mayans were also famous for their highly developed mathematics, something perhaps most evident in their calendars, right? So first of all, they had, much like the calendar we already discussed from the Oaxaca region, they had this kind of, interlocking, this calendar, 52-year calendar based on interlocking 260 and 365-day cycles. But they also developed an absolute calendar known as the long count, which had a fixed point in the past, right? So what I personally find very interesting here is that it kind of represents different conceptions of time, right? You have kind of the interlocking calendar with these two different cycles, which seem to reflect the kind of a conception of time where it's repetitive, it's cyclical, history repeats itself. We already talked about this idea of multiple creations, but then you have an absolute calendar, which kind of corresponds to how we today tend to think of time, right? There is the past, the present, and the future, right? And things move in a linear way. And it's kind of interesting that the long calendar, from a historian's point of view, helps us to really define in a more precise way the dates of things, right? It's been correlated with the European calendar. It was used to mark dynastic dates, periods of reign of different rulers, very much the way calendars in Europe often were used. And the long calendar also demonstrates to us they had a very sophisticated understanding of astronomy, right? So the calendar was tied to the movements of celestial bodies, including the sun, moon, and Venus, which, not surprisingly, were associated with deities. The Mayan calendar was very accurate, incredibly accurate. They were able to precisely adjust the lunar calendar to the actual length of the lunar cycle, 29.53 days. And not surprisingly, astronomical observations were also highly accurate. One of the first people to recognize that the morning and evening stars were in fact one and the same. Now, we should know, you're never going to have a situation where there is kind of a capital to the Mayan Empire. Right? During the classic period, in particular, no one city will dominate the Mayan region. Rather, you have a number of important cities surrounded by smaller subject towns. And a really good example of a major Mayan city from this period would be Tikal, which covered 14 square miles and had more than 3,000 structures laid out on a grid. Right? Of course, a grid structure, something we find very often in many different civilizations, including our own, if we think about Manhattan. So Tikal was an important center in the late formative period, in part because it had a very strategic position in terms of resources. It was located near a source of flint. It also had river access to both the Gulf and the Caribbean coasts. And so that was a major factor in why it became a major city. It was ruled by a single dynasty of 39 Jaguar Paw rulers. This is kind of the term that they use to define that particular dynasty, running from the early classic period until the 8th century. We know that it definitely had connections with Teotihuacán. One ruler who went by the name, if you translate it, Curl Nose, who took the throne in 379, may have married into a ruling family of the Teotihuacan-dominated city of Caminaljuyu. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I can't promise you that that is the case. In any event, at some point we hit what might be considered a period of stagnation. It's not that things precipitously go into decline, but there isn't much by way of advancement at some point. Primarily with Tikal, but also much of the lowland Mayan area, the surrounding area. And this is from the mid-6th century onward. And in some ways, what's most evident in this regard is we see a pretty much a very long 100-year hiatus in construction, where really not much is happening. This is followed by a period of brief revitalization, evident primarily in the expanded regional influence of Tikal, and this period begins with the reign of Al-Kakao, roughly reigning between 682 and 723. We're not quite sure exactly when his reign came to an end. So Al-Kakao and his two immediate successors would embark on an ambitious building program, right? So that was another indication that things were moving in a positive direction. And many of the kind of monumental structures that you might find there today date from this period, including the large temples that dominate this site. But then, after the death of Chitam, who reigned beginning in 769, we're not quite sure when his reign came to an end. So the second successor of Al-Kakao, he is, in fact, the last ruler of the Jaguar Paw Dynasty. And after that, Tikal goes into a period of decline, never to recover. And in fact, this in a way is a harbinger to the collapse of Mayan civilization in its entirety. At least this particular phase of it. Between 800 and 900 CE, Mayan civilization collapses in the southern lowlands. Many of the cities there are abandoned. The causes of this are not entirely known, though we think a major factor may have been that at some point a combination of population growth and depletion of agricultural land led to an inability to produce enough food, and then this might have resulted in conflict. In any event, warfare was almost certainly another factor, whether it was caused by that or not. Whatever the cause, the decline is not something that happens in a very short period of time. It's kind of drawn out over roughly 100 years, and eventually probably also reflected a kind of loss of confidence in the ruling elite, but probably in large measure because they're not able to deal with these other issues confronting society at the time. So Mayan civilization is going to rebound one last time before fizzling out altogether. It's a rather extended rebound and corresponds to basically a relocating of Mayan civilization to the northern part of the Yucatan. And this final phase is going to center around the site of Chichén Itzá, located near a sacred well, and it becomes a very important center between the 9th and 12th centuries. And we should note it had the largest ball court in the Mayan area. I mean, very impressive. You might have heard of Chichén Itzá, a very popular tourist destination. I'm one of those tourists who went there. And yes, I have to say the ball court was pretty impressive. And here you see it. I was quite happy to find an image without hundreds of tourists meandering about, which is the usual state of affairs. And again, I was pretty impressed with it. In any event, after Chichén Itzá's decline, it doesn't come to an immediate end. Things kind of relocate once more to the site of Mayapan. That will become the main mine center, but only for a short while. And by the time the Spanish arrived, very little is evident of the once great civilization that had been the mines. Right? What they found was a fairly large number of small competing centers. Very little evidence of a kind of sophisticated civilization. But of course, they eventually found the ruins of what once had been. In any event, that marks the end of the first half of this lecture. And so when we kind of pick up the story, mostly we're going to be looking at the Aztec, of course, but then shifting to developments in the Andean region.